All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our last exit ticket recap video. The clearest points you can see on the screen here. The most common by far, observer bias, observer effects, and reactivity, which is great. Some other clear points, observation versus self-report, reading journal articles, etc. For the muddiest points, the most common was observer bias versus observer effects versus reactivity, like how to tell them apart. A couple people mentioned activity number 1 and activity number 2. I'm not going to address them in the exit ticket recap, and that's just because I am posting the key for it. So if you look at the key and you're still a little confused, feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to talk more, but definitely consult that key. And then applying validities to the article and applying concepts to real life situations, like finding concepts in an article. So I will address those, the ones that are outlined in red boxes. All right, so for observer bias versus observer effect versus reactivity, how to tell them apart, it might help you to think about who is being affected and why are they being affected. Because remember, these are all biases that come into play when researchers are making observations as a way of measuring some variable, like measuring helping behavior, or in the article you read, measuring, territoriality, staying longer in a parking spot. And so because they are observations, they are subject to these biases. You have to be careful about whether these biases are affecting the measurements. So if you are thinking about who is being affected, the only one that affects just the researcher is observer bias. So if it's only the researcher being affected, if the participant is not affected at all, then that means it's observer bias. So the researcher's own bias is affecting their observation of the participants, regardless of the participant's actual behavior. So that's like when you did the activity, I think it was number 1 from last week, when you were creating your own observational study and you came up with that operational definition for holding the door open. And I asked you to think about whether observer bias could affect your results. There's a possibility that if observers are observing men and women opening the door, perhaps they have gender stereotypes that are going to influence their observations. Maybe they'll be more likely to, actually see a male participant holding the door open than a female participant just because of their own biases. So in that case, it would be observer bias. Their own biases are affecting how they make observations. And that's because we're human, right? As you'll learn about in other psych courses, we are affected by our own biases. We even talked about how we're affected by intuition biases earlier this semester, right? So there's always the possibility that our own biases are influencing how we make observations. That's observer bias. Now, if the participant is being affected, so it's not just the researcher with their own observations being biased, if the participant's behavior is actually changing in some way, then that means it's either observer effects or reactivity. And for both of these, the participant's behavior is actually being affected, which then influences how it gets observed by the researcher. So if it's the participant being affected, there's still 2 options. So then you want to ask why. So why is the participant's behavior being affected? If the reason the participant's behavior is being affected is because the researcher's bias is giving subtle cues to the participant, that would be like the maze bright, maze dull rats or clever Hans from the textbook, right? In those cases, it was the researcher who was actually influencing the participants responding like clever Hans. If the person giving the math test knew the answer, then even though they didn't realize it, they were giving very subtle cues to clever Hans of when to stop tapping his hoof, right? That's observer effects. So if the reason the participant's behavior is changing is because of the researcher giving them cues, which is based on their own biases, then that makes it observer effects. So observer effects is kind of like a enhanced version of observer bias. And observer bias is just the researcher's own observations being affected, but with observer effects, the researcher's bias actually influences what the participants are actually doing. So it's kind of like observer bias on steroids, actually affecting the participant too. But if the participant's behavior is affected just because the researcher is present, not because of the researcher's bias giving cues to them, but just the mere fact that the researcher is there at all. So like if you are an education major and you go do your block and the first day that you're in the classroom, maybe those kids are going to be unusually well behaved. It's because they know you're there and they're on their best behavior for you. That's reactivity. Or like the example we talked about in the slides with the example of the study where the participant is doing an arm strength test, right? And just because the researcher is watching them, they don't perform as well, right? That would be reactivity. So being reactive reactive to what's going on, being reactive to the presence of the researcher. Now, I know these three terms can be easy to mix up. The way to really keep them straight is to think about who's being affected and think about why they're being affected, and honestly just to practice them. So like making flashcards, right, and testing yourself, because the terminology is so similar on these. You might want to do some memorization to help you remember what's what. All right, and then one person had also asked, how do these biases, how do these actually threaten construct validity? The issue is that these biases are all threats to the accurate measurement of a variable. So you did an activity in one of your questions, your homework questions, that you were responding to the question of, how are these an issue? Like if you're measuring this, you might actually be measuring this instead of this, right? Like if you have observer bias, you're actually measuring the researcher's bias and not the participant's, not the participant's behavior. Or if you have reactivity, then you're actually measuring the participant's response to the researcher and not their actual whatever it is, the variable. Basically, that's why it's a threat to construct validity, because construct validity is all about making sure that you are accurately measuring what you're trying to measure. But if you have one of these biases affecting your observational measurement, then you're not measuring what you're trying to measure. Like with Clever Hans, you're not actually measuring the horse's ability to do math. That's what they were trying to measure, of whether Clever Hans could really do math. But because they had observer effects, they weren't measuring his ability to do math. They were actually measuring something else. They were measuring his ability to pick up on his questioner's cues, which again is still kind of interesting, right? That the horse could pick up on that. That's kind of cool, but it wasn't what they were trying to measure. And that's the problem of construct validity. You're trying to make sure that you really are getting at what you say you're getting at. You really are measuring what you say you're measuring. Like the example where you made your own study on whether men and women hold the door open, right? If you're actually measuring observer bias, then you're not measuring whether men or women are holding the door open. You're measuring whether the researcher thinks men or women are according to their gender stereotypes. So, or if the example of children being unusually well behaved with reactivity, you're not really measuring children's classroom behavior. You're measuring their classroom behavior when someone new is there. So it's this issue of you're measuring something else other than what you were trying to get at. So that's how these three are problematic. That's why we have to be really careful with them when we're doing observational research. Okay, and then lastly, applying validities to the article and applying concepts to real life situations, like finding concepts in an article. I don't have really big tips for you for this. I just want to mention that this gets easier with time and practice. So just like reading articles, I enjoyed reading your guys' response in homework number 18, where you told me a little bit about how your experience of reading articles has changed over the semester. A lot of you mentioned that it was really hard at the beginning, but with each one that you did, it got easier and easier, and now it's not so bad. It just takes practice, right? And the same thing goes for this idea of identifying methods concepts and seeing where they're playing out in real life or in articles that you're reading. It just takes practice. You've got some practice in this class, and you're going to practice these skills more when you take Methods 2 and the Pillar courses and the advanced courses as well. So you're going to continue to practice these skills. This was just kind of your introduction in this class to how to read articles, how to identify concepts, what concepts matter in methodology for psych research, and you've done some practice with identifying them in action, but you will practice them more later. I didn't put this in the slides, but it's also related to the idea of Bloom's taxonomy, right? You have to be at the base of that pyramid with the remembering and understanding before you can move upward to applying and analyzing and creating and whatnot. So if you feel like you're not so great at the applying part right now, that's okay. You're really getting at the base of the pyramid right now. You're at the remembering and understanding, and that's a building block. You have to have that piece before you can apply it. So your future classes will help you apply those skills, help you practice those skills a lot more. All right, hopefully this was helpful for you guys, but as usual, if there's anything else that you're a little confused on, or you heard me say something and you're like, wait, what? You should feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to chat with you in more detail about these things. All right.